It was the perfect day for it to happen. I am surrounded by friends and family enjoying the happy occasion. Outside the whirlwind of merriment are curious onlookers who are either sneaking peeks at the celebrating crowd or enviously watching, eager to get on the guest list. My father, Harrison Williams, sat at the head of the long table and presided over the festivities. He smiled broadly as he finished a story that elicited laughter. Numerous waiters and waitresses hurried to fulfill the various orders of the assembled guests. A waiter deftly placed a rare third glass of Chardonnay in front of my mother, Tracy Williams. She absent-mindedly ran her fingers along the stem of the glass, smiled at her husband, and then turned her attention to me. The look of pride and love coming from my mother was another wonderful bonus for me. I thought about how much love and sacrifice my family had put forth to put me in this position. I was on the cusp of becoming part of the world I had dreamed of since childhood. It wasn't easy. I had to carefully schedule my college classes to coincide with my part-time job at the bank and make time to spend time with my girlfriend. For 4 long years, I rushed from school to work. And after work, I would come home to study and discuss the theorizing of my professors with my father's real-life experiences. I had to walk a thin tightrope to avoid agitating my father when we discussed radical changes in business. Harrison Williams's business philosophy boiled down to the adage, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Nevertheless, sometimes I would convince my father to try out a new idea and he would authorize a trial run to see if the new practice would be beneficial. Sometimes the proposed idea would completely fail, and we would spend countless hours discussing it, trying to come to a consensus on why it failed. Sometimes the idea was successful, but not to the extent we had envisioned, and we would carefully refine it to maximize profits. And once a new idea was a resounding success, and I had to restrain the impulse to say to my father, "I told you so." I was also fearless in letting my professors know which ideas passed the test and which ones they should exclude from discussion in the ivory tower. Many professors resented publicly exposing the failures of their business models, and my grades reflected that prejudice to some extent. But I felt it was my duty to share my experience with my students so that they would not make similar mistakes when they made a living. Although my ethical stance prevented me from graduating with honors, I still received my degree, which was one reason to celebrate. Now, armed with a business degree, I was to join my father in running the family bank that had provided our family's livelihood for 6 generations. I already had my eye on the girl I expected to help me become the 7th generation. Stacy Bachman sat next to me and talked to her mother, who sat across the table from Stacy. Stacy and I have known each other all our lives. We were classmates throughout high school. We started dating in our senior year of high school. She followed me to community college, and although our time together was limited due to school and work, she and I continued our relationship. Weekend dates were rare, but we still managed to get out on a date. I was hell-bent on ending this relationship. In that respect, I was a very average American male. Stacy had managed to restrain me with comments about wanting to marry a virgin and curb my lust by occasionally attacking me. Now, 5 years into our relationship, the countdown had finally begun. I checked my pants pocket for the 100th time to make sure the box with the diamond engagement ring was still there. After she accepted my proposal, Stacy, her friends, and family could start planning the wedding. I decided to take the opportunity to assess Stacy's appearance. Stacy was petite, with dirty blonde hair and breasts that stood out against her slim figure, sort of like Jennifer Love Hewitt. She had hazel eyes that drew the eye. Seductive thin lips created a smile on her angular face that could win over any man. She was intelligent, charming, and attractive. Practically the entire town was ready to welcome her into their family. Of course, some potential adopters had lower motives than others. She was the object of many men's wet dreams and fantasies as they made love to their girlfriends or wives. I continued to watch as Stacy burst into laughter in response to her mother's remark. She unknowingly brushed away a strand of hair that had fallen in her face. I thought about how I would reward her now that I would start working for my father and get a decent paycheck while he prepared me for management. I was anticipating a trip to Hawaii, a Christmas vacation in London, and a 3-day weekend at the beach for us. And we were planning a family. I wanted a son and a daughter, but just as long as the kids were healthy, and that was the main thing. I nudged Stacy to make a little remark, and she smiled at me and gave me a brotherly pat on the shoulder, stepping into the conversation from the other side of her. I was slightly concerned by her carefree attitude, but considered it a result of the entire table celebrating the good fortune of Stacy and I graduating. I was soon involved in a conversation with Stacy's father. Mr. Bachman wanted to know if I would be going with a group of men who were to go hunting in Alaska. The group consisted of the elite of the town. All the driving forces, whether doctors, lawyers, or businessmen, migrated to this student clique. By inviting me, they made it clear that I was expected to join their ranks. And many of this power elite were present at the dinner table today. They came not only out of a sense of commercial loyalty, but also because of the high esteem in which the Williamses and Bachmans were held in the community. My father helped many during his career as president of Camden Bank and Trust. My mother tirelessly participated in many community projects to help the less fortunate members of society. The Bachmans did the same, making significant donations to charitable organizations. Charles Bachman, the owner of the family factory, was the wealthiest man in Camden, and he did all his personal and business banking with the help of my father. Now that Stacy and I were engaged, the two families would join together to form a local dynasty. It will be the Camden equivalent of Prince William marrying Kate Middleton. And we'll live happily ever after, I thought, gazing adoringly at my future bride. Charles Bachman rose from the table with a raised glass of wine and waited for the conversations to subside, and for everyone to pay attention to him. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out today to help us celebrate. It seems like it was just yesterday when Stacy, Troy, and their classmates started school together. For all the crayon drawings that decorated our refrigerator, for all the countless hours spent doing homework, for all the times we attended your school events and cheered you on, Stacy, for making your mom and I the happiest and proudest parents when you became an adult. And I would like to properly express the love and feelings I have for you, my child. He said this with misty eyes. Stacy spontaneously stood up and rushed to her father to hug him, and the audience broke into applause. I love you and Mommy so much, Daddy, she exclaimed. That brought more applause. Well, baby, let's get to the fun part. As a graduation present, we're giving you a pair of tickets to an all-summer paid tour of Europe. Stacy squealed with delight and kissed her dad and mom as they handed her a thick envelope. I started to figure out if I could take that much time off work. It didn't matter if I couldn't. I was sure that Stacy and her lucky girlfriend would be able to enjoy the trip of a lifetime. It would push back our wedding date, but at least I would be able to save up money while Stacy had fun. Deciding it was now or never, I stood up and walked over to Stacy. I dug in my pocket and pulled out a jewelry box. I walked over to Stacy and Mr. and Mrs. Bachman stepped back, graciously giving Stacy and I the center seat. Stacy looked at me perplexed as I stood next to her. I started, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who came here tonight to help celebrate our graduation from college. And while to Mr. Bachman it may have seemed like yesterday, to me it was like Chinese water torture. This joking remark drew laughter from the audience. But the one thing that made it all bearable was the wonderful woman standing next to me. In first grade, we drank milk from the same carton. In sixth grade, we were sent to the principal's office together for passing notes, I said with a raised eyebrow, which caused another round of laughter. I eventually wised up, I continued, and asked her out on a date at my high school graduation. After that, we both went to college here, and although studying and working didn't allow me to see her as often as I would have liked, it made me appreciate her even more. I turned to Stacy and looked into her face. And I really appreciate you, Stacy. I've known for a long time what you mean to me. I've loved you since first grade. I know what you will mean to me for the rest of my life because I intend to say, I love you to you for the rest of my life. Dropping to one knee, I handed her the box and began to open it. I noticed Stacy's eyes widen and she brought her hand up to her open mouth. She was beginning to show signs of hyperventilation. Stacy Ellen Bachman, will you marry me? There was dead silence in the restaurant, all eyes fixed on the dramatic scene playing out before them. They held their breath, waiting for what was to come in response to Stacy's cheer. I continued to gaze lovingly at Stacy's face, which reflected the shock of the proposal. Stacy's eyes were wildly gawking back and forth at the table, then at me, then at the table, then at me. While this pregnant pause lasted, a disturbing thought began to form in my brain. What at first seemed like disbelieving shock now turned into panic. She was staring at the table again, oblivious to me kneeling with a 2-carat flawless diamond ring outstretched to her. David, she pleaded. and rushed to the front door. The creak of a chair being hurriedly pushed away from the table was heard. The disbelieving and shocked onlookers saw someone running after Stacy. As I ran past, the person turned around to look at me and chased after Stacy. It was David Porter, my best friend and the guy I was going to ask to be my best man. The implications of Stacy and David's actions reached the minds of everyone present, and all their attention was on me kneeling and comprehending what was happening. I slowly rose from my knee and began frantically shoving the box back into my pocket. I took a zombified step towards the back door, away from Stacy. I didn't look at anyone, blindly traversing the steps leading away from the building. Eyes full of unshed tears followed me as I passed my car and began the long, hard drive home. I sat at my desk, the rays of the morning sun flooding my office. Turning my chair around, I stared moodily at the empty buildings crumbling in the town square. One of those abandoned buildings was the site of my proposal fiasco. It had been 6 years since my humiliation in front of the entire town. 6 long years I have been the object of jokes all over Washington County. 6 long years of being laughed at behind my back. The restaurant continued to operate. Stacy moved on. David moved on. The city moved on. The whole damn world moved on. The only one who hadn't moved on was me, chained by inheritance and necessity to the Camden Bank and Trust. The intercom buzzed. "Troy, Mrs. Fuller is here to see you." I felt a slight annoyance before I said, "Send her in." No sooner had the door opened than I was already up from the table and heading towards her. "Let me take that, Mrs. Fuller," I said, looking at the large box the woman was carrying with some concern. Damn it, Janet, you should have taken it to her, I thought. I looked at the thin, attractive brunette who was accompanying the infirm old lady. I picked up the box and quickly set it on my desk, then helped Mrs. Fuller into a chair. "How are you, Mrs. Fuller? Is there anything I can help you with?" No, not at all, my child. I just wanted to bring you a jar of retro tomatoes from my vegetable garden. I still remember how much you love them." Despite my worries, my mood improved when I remembered all the trips to Mrs. Fuller's vegetable garden as a child. Planting and digging up potatoes, onions, and peanuts, staking stakes for tomatoes, stakes for peas and beans to hold on to, endless watering of cantaloupes, honey melons, and watermelons, picking and plucking corn, climbing apple, peach, and plum trees to harvest. It's amazing that what I now perceive as hard labor was a joy as a child. Maybe civilization is set up the other way around, I suggested. "Mrs. Fuller, may I offer you something to drink?" "Well, I wouldn't mind a glass of lemonade or sweet tea if you don't mind." "Of course not. Miss Temple, if you don't mind." Without noticing Mrs. Fuller, Janet Temple winked at me and said, "Sure, Troy." She went off to run her errand, ignoring the barely perceptible look of irritation on my face. I sat down in the chair next to Mrs. Fuller, as befitted her status as a very favorite customer. "Are you sure there's nothing I can do for you today, Mrs. Fuller?" I could see that she hesitated. The kindly old lady was agonizing over how to solve this dilemma. "Mr. Williams, Troy, Mrs. Fuller, I will always be Troy to you," I interrupted her gently. The lady smiled, pleased that I recognized her status above my own. "Thank you, Troy. I have this situation. I need a personal loan in the amount of $20,000. At that moment, Janet Temple entered the office with a tray containing 2 glasses filled with ice cubes and a pitcher of lemonade. She poured the drinks and left. "I need a loan, but I have nothing to provide it," Mrs. Fuller said shamefacedly. "Don't do this, don't 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 do this," my brain ordered me. "May I ask what you need the money for, Mrs. Fuller?" "It's my grandson. He's finishing his last year of college. But something happened to his student loan papers. I told him I would try to pay his tuition until the problem with his papers is resolved." "How long do you need the money for?" I mentally sighed, realizing I was going to do this. "I can pay them off in a year, Troy. He'll sort out the paperwork on his other loan and it'll count against your loan. Besides, he'll get a grant and reimburse me. Plus, he'll have a good job after graduation so there won't be a problem with the payments." "This is for Paul? Your daughter's oldest boy? Do they still live in Seattle?" I asked, trying to remember Donna's son and the few times I'd met him when they came to visit Mrs. Fuller. Then I remembered how I had been in love with Donna Fuller years ago. But that had only been a youthful fantasy. I smiled regretfully, done with the past. As the conversation continued, I mentally worked out the amount of the payments and asked if she was happy with the monthly installments. She paused and asked what they would be for a year and a half. Not trusting myself 100%, I pulled out a calculator and gave her the result. She agreed it was suitable, and I called Tom Jenkins in the loan department, told him the terms, and asked him to prepare the loan documents for Mrs. Fuller to sign. We spent the next 30 minutes reminiscing and drinking lemonade. I then escorted Mrs. Fuller to the loan department and assigned the very capable Tom Jenkins to take care of Mrs. Fuller. Mrs. Fuller insisted on kissing me on the cheek and said, "Thank you, Troy. You remind me of your father. There aren't many bankers making unsecured loans these days." "Mrs. Fuller, your family has always cooperated with us. I know your word is strong enough," I assured an old family friend. "You just keep sending me tomatoes. And maybe an apple pie?" I begged. And Mrs. Fuller, laughing, said, "I would have pie tomorrow." Back in my office, I found Janet Temple sorting tomatoes and separating the ripe red ones from the green ones. "What are you doing with my tomatoes?" I asked. "Asked me." "Troy, we're having BLT sandwiches for dinner tonight." "Who is this we you speak of, Miss Temple?" I walked up behind her and snuggled up to her. She smiled. "By the way, Miss Temple, it wouldn't hurt to be a little more professional in the office." "Yes, Mr. Williams." "Nod." She turned to face me and put her arm around my broad shoulders. "You gave her an unsecured loan, didn't you? And lowered the interest rate so we didn't actually earn anything on this deal." "Yes, that's right, Janet." "That's Miss Temple for you, Troy," she corrected her feckless boss and kissed me again. "If you keep falling for every bad luck story, you won't last long in the business. No, if that happens, I'll just take my tomatoes and get a job somewhere." "Our tomatoes," Janet corrected, placing her hands on top of mine. "My tomatoes," I replied. "Ours." "Mine." "Ours." "Mine." A quiet giggle came from my office. Turns out bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches were a daily special in my apartment that evening, and the Janet Temple was a welcome dessert. As dawn broke, I woke up and bustled around getting ready for my morning run. Putting on my running clothes, I kissed Janet on the top of her head, which made her smile as she stretched and woke up. "Why don't you go back to bed and work out here?" "Don't tempt me. Are you going to shower here or at your place?" "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't want to start the shower and get under ice water because you've already used it up," I explained. "I can wait for you and we'll shower together," Janet suggested. I paused. "No?" She pouted sadly. "Well, I guess I'd better go home and get dressed for work." "Say nah." "When are you going to start leaving your clothes here already, Janet?" I asked. "It'll be easier that way." "Oh, Troy, let's not start that topic again. You go and have a great run and I'll take a quick shower and I'll see you at work." She kissed me and offered to go for a run while she got ready to clean up. I prepared for the run by doing my warm-up and stretching exercises. I looked around my house. Not many people can say they live in the same building where they work. Even fewer who live in a 3-story bank building that takes up an entire city block. As I did in the morning, I marveled at the Greco-Roman architectural style, granite stone and Doric columns rising majestically at the building's front entrance. My ancestor built the first permanent building in the fledgling city. He studied well the effect he wanted to produce. Prosperity and permanence were the safeguards that motivated other builders. They copied exactly the architectural theme of the bank, and the entire town square epitomized wealth, employment, and industry. Or was, I thought bitterly, looking at the ghostly buildings of the dilapidated town square. Now my bank remained the last bastion, the last reminder of a past that had brought so many regrets. As I ran, a measured pace broke the silence where only the sounds of my footsteps and breathing could be heard. I used this time as silence. A time for reflection and concentration. My first thought was of business, of Camden Bank and Trust. It was besieged by enemies, both from within and without. Since taking over as president of the bank, I had to remain vigilant every day. It was enough to make one wrong move, and all my hard work, the work of my father and previous generations, would be taken away from me. So many decisions to make, and no one could help me. Not for the first time, as I finished my run and walked up the stairs to my third-floor apartment, I felt completely alone. How I wished I could forget about all my problems. A shower and a quick rest would be enough. People depended on me. I undressed and carefully stepped into the shower. Within seconds, the hot water turned to cold splashes. Another grievance I'll have to voice to Janet, I thought as I hurried into the tub. At 9 in the morning, I would sit down at my desk and work until official banking hours began. In fact, I had been working since 7 in the morning preparing transactions on behalf of the bank. If all went well, it would go on like this all day. At 9:25, the intercom bell rang. "Mr. Williams, you have a visitor." The strangeness in Janet's voice alerted my defenses. Why hadn't she informed me of the identity of these visitors? The little voice mentally told me that I should refuse the callers, citing my busy work schedule that would make it impossible for me to meet with the visitors today. Let another staff member take care of any problem that might arise. Realizing that I had paused unnecessarily in answering Janet's call, I hesitantly told her to escort the visitors to my office. The door opened, and Carla Robbins, Susan Moy, and Stacy Ellen Porter, aka Bachman, entered the office. It was the first time I had seen Stacy up close in 6 years. The passing years had done her good. Her facial features had changed from their previous angularity to a more rounded shape. She'd gone from a girl to a young woman in the prime of her life. "Hi, Troy," she tried desperately to catch my gaze. I knew she was trying to start a dialogue before the barricades started. In response, I waved my hand toward the chairs on their side of the table. Carla tried to hug me, but I was aware of my reluctance to make bodily contact with the three of them. If I refused Carla's hug, Stacy couldn't take offense at the rejection. The three ladies quickly settled into their chairs. I sat down at my desk. "How do you do, Carla, Susan, Mrs. Porter? What can I do for you ladies today?" Stacy flinched at the cold politeness in my reply. There was no warmth in the greeting, no hint of a willingness to forgive a past offense with the passage of time. She noticed that my gaze was fixed on the classmates accompanying her. "Please, Troy, I'm still Stacy. I would appreciate it if you would call me by my first name." "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Porter. I ask again, what can I do for you today?" "It's been 10 years since we graduated, Troy. We are on the reunion committee. We are trying to recruit new members to the committee and support the reunion." Susan took the lead in explaining the purpose of their visit. I remained silent. I had learned over the course of my career that silence was a necessary and effective negotiating tool. Granted, this wasn't the usual business transaction I was used to, but the same principles applied. "So, Troy?" Susan asked with desperation. I'm sorry, Susan, I didn't hear anything that required me to comment." Susan sighed. "Why don't you help out and head up the committee, Troy?" A moment passed before I answered. "Susan, isn't it traditional for the president of the graduating class to head the reunion committee?" Susan hesitated, realizing where the conversation was leading. "Yes, Troy, but—" "Refresh my memory, Carla." I turned to the woman I had interrupted. "Who was our class president?" "Eek. David Porter." "That's right, Carla. I think you're talking to the wrong person." "David already said he wouldn't be on the committee, Troy," Stacy explained. I didn't show in any way that I had heard Stacy's comment or was going to respond to it. "We could really use your help, Troy," Carla offered. "I understand, Carla, but since I won't be attending the reunion, I don't see the need to be on your committee." I pressed the intercom button. "Miss Temple, please come in." I realized that this restless trio was looking for a new way to attack, as all three insisted on my presence. Before I could comment, Janet Temple entered the office. "Miss Temple, please escort our guests out of my office. I regret to inform you that I have an urgent matter, so you'll have to excuse me." "Come on, Troy, you just have to attend your classmates' reunion," Carla insisted with the last of her strength. I turned my attention back to my three classmates. "Before you all leave, I'd like to tell you a little story about what you owe people," I began sourly. A beautiful woman walks into a bar. No sooner does she sit down than a man appears in front of her. "Madam," he says, "for your information, I am one of the richest men in the world. I am so stunned by your beauty that I am willing to pay you $10 million to spend 1 hour making love to you." At first, the woman was shocked by such an offer. Then she began to think about what $10 million dollars could buy. "Okay, I will make love to you for $10 billion, she replies. The man then asks, Will you sleep with me for $5? Now the woman was very upset at this insult. $5, what do you take me for? She shouts to the man. That's what we've already figured out. Now we're just discussing the price. Do you understand the meaning of the word debt in this story? I asked my 3 classmates. Perhaps I can give you a better example. Imagine some poor dumb bastard thinks he's found the perfect woman for him, but he gets humiliated when she runs off with his best friend. What the hell do you think he should get? The opportunity to jump up and do her a favor when he sees her for the first time in years. There was dead silence and icy stares in response to the insults. I left the office through the back door, which saved me the awkward situation of shaking their hands. I heard Stacy's voice asking me to stop. Once again, I chose to ignore the traitor. I quickly walked up the stairs and paced the apartment. I continued to wander around the apartment. I systematically checked the views from the windows, hoping to spot the departure of the trio of classmates who had ambushed me. I heard the door open and Janet's footsteps headed toward me. I spun on my wheels and hissed, "Never! Never! Don't ever do that to me again if you want to keep your job. Do you understand me?" She recoiled in shock at the venomous note in my strained voice. "I'm sorry, Troy. I didn't know how to feel about it." She responded with a dismissive apology. "Well, you damn well better find another way if this woman ever comes to see me again." "They didn't tell me who they were. They just said they were your classmates," she protested. I paused to calm down, but there was still awkwardness between us. "Are they gone already?" I asked, looking out one of the windows. With my peripheral vision, I noticed Janet nodding in response to my question. I could see that she almost cried at my insult, but she nodded in agreement, not trusting her voice not to break down into sobs. Time to get back to work then. I roughly walked out of the apartment and headed downstairs to my office. Janet stayed in my apartment to clean up and fix her makeup before appearing at her desk. When closing time came, I was left alone in my apartment all night. This pattern continued for 2 weeks while Janet focused solely on her work and I focused on mine. On Thursday afternoon, just before closing time, Janet walked into my office. With tears in her eyes, she asked me in a trembling voice, "Will you ever forgive me?" I walked over to her and hugged her as she began to cry. We went upstairs to my apartment and I did my best to make up for all the pain I had caused her. By Friday morning, everything was back to normal. Saturday morning, we spent relaxing in my bed. We were talking into the pillow when she broached the subject. "Why do you hate her so much, Troy? Why can't you get over her?" she asked, drawing lazy circles on my chest with her fingernail. I knew who she meant. I decided to tell her it was none of her damn business. I sighed. "You moved here 4 years ago, Janet, so you don't know the whole story. I'll tell it to you once and only once, and I'll never discuss it with you again. Deal?" She looked at me with her big brown eyes and nodded seriously. "You know about her and me, and how I made a complete ass of myself at the prom by proposing to her. I know you must have heard that story 1,000 times in this town." Her look spoke volumes about the truth of my words. Even after 6 years, I was still ridiculed by the whole town. By this time, my act had become an urban legend and was endlessly discussed. You have to realize that we all grew up around each other, played with each other, went to school with each other. I paused, then banished the reluctance to say their names. David and Stacy have been my closest friends since kindergarten. Stacy insisted on playing house with her, and we attended countless lunches with imaginary pies, cokes, cakes, ice cream, and candy. One day, I would be a father and David would be our baby. The next day, David would be a father and I would be their child. Stacy, of course, was always the mother who dictated our actions. As we got older, David and I fell into that period of childhood when we thought all girls had STDs and avoided Stacy like the plague. Stacy took it hard at first, but then she moved on to hanging out with all her girlfriends. David and I were as close as brothers. We were at each other's houses every day, playing baseball or Boy Scouts or soccer. We always had something going on. As I began to reminisce, I realized I couldn't help but smile at that memory. But it was short-lived as I continued the story. We were still seeing each other. All of our parents socialized at the country club, at parties and charity events. And of course, we were in the same class and had the same classes and teachers. Then middle school came, and something magical happened to all the girls. Puberty began to turn the girls into fantastic creatures. Breasts began to appear, and asses filled skirts and pants. And like every teenager, well, at least every heterosexual teenager, we started lusting after these girls we'd ignored for years. But they weren't going to make life easy for any of us guys. So we had to jump through hoops like carrying books for them, buying them cheap bracelets or rings, or letting them know that another boy was paying attention to us. That's exactly what happened to me and David. We started to see Stacy in a new light and, surprisingly, we both wanted her. And even more surprisingly, we didn't want the other one to succeed. And the biggest surprise of all, Stacy decided she wanted David. You know, even at such an early age, being rejected was really hard, but I recovered. I started dating David and Stacy, but I also continued to be friends with them. At some point, there was a rift between Stacy and David. He started cheating on her and openly dating others. This threw Stacy off balance, and the week before prom, she came to me and asked me to take her to prom. I went to David and told him. He said it was fine with him. He wasn't going to see her again. We started dating and feelings developed between us. I started doing things besides dating, helping her with her homework, washing her car, stuff like that. I even started spending time getting to know her parents better. I'd go to them and talk them into playing a game of chess and losing to Mr. Bachman, always listening to him lecture about whatever interested him. It was usually business, especially concerning Bachman Enterprises. He was always throwing out derogatory phrases like in business, the big ones eat the little ones, or do unto others so that they don't do unto you. I just sat and listened about the world according to Charles Bachman, hoping to impress him. College came, and Stacy knew I was determined to prepare for our future. We had been talking about getting engaged and getting married for a long time. She knew I would be ready as soon as we graduated from college, so it wasn't a lightning bolt appearing out of the blue. She knew. We talked about the kids and everything. She should have expected. I grudgingly picked at my words, trying to make verbal sense of a situation I still couldn't explain, much less understand. She even picked out that damn ring, commented I, looking at Janet hoping it made sense. Janet nodded and patted my hand, letting me know she understood. Gathering my composure, I continued. I don't know when David returned to the stage. I had no idea she and David were dating. If she had told me, maybe I wouldn't be here today. Maybe none of this would have happened. But I continued to see her every day at school and every weekend, and I had no idea that anything was wrong. So here I am, in front of the whole world, everyone laughing at me and discussing Stacy and David's little Romeo and Juliet-style romance. I never really thought about how Stacy felt, but it was enough for me that Stacy decided to take him with her to Europe and give him to her parents as a graduation present. She runs away with him. They go to London, to Paris, to Rome, to Athens, and I'm left in Camden with my heart ripped out of my body. Every goddamn day I have to be courageous, go to my job, and pretend no one knows what happened to me. Stacy and David returned home and had a whirlwind wedding to dispel rumors of their European affair. Afterward, they were moved out of state until the uproar subsided. Stacy and David were hired at one of Charles Bachman's subsidiaries in California until all the hoopla died down. In the meantime, Charles Bachman is mad as hell at me for putting his daughter and his family in a situation of public ridicule. My little performance had far-reaching consequences. The town is divided on who is to blame for this fiasco. Unfortunately, Charles Bachman was not going to stand by and let people defame his little girl. He visited my father and me at the bank and completely blamed it on me. He then told us that he had looked into the matter and decided that our town needed another bank to break what he called our stranglehold on the town. He was there to close his accounts. They would be invested in a new bank that opened across town, Bachman's Savings Bank and Loans. My father tried to convince him not to do it. It would have caused a serious rupture in the bank's finances. But Charles Bachman wasn't going to say no, so he took his money, and my father had to find alternative sources of financing to meet his obligations. Word got to him that he was in a tight spot, so he negotiated unfavorably. Commercial lenders were charging him exorbitant rates, and he had to agree to keep the bank afloat. It was a daily, hourly struggle to keep the doors open. But Charles Bachman wasn't done. The paychecks of all Bachman's industry employees were transferred to Bachman's savings and loans accounts, and all employees were forced to open accounts at Bachman's for direct deposits, debit and credit cards. Then came auto and home loans at rates that my father wouldn't have been able to cover because of the problems we were facing. Customers were leaving in droves. Bachman's ATMs crowded the neighborhoods as small businessmen were persuaded to trade in our cars for theirs. Basically, he had us in a vice and was not going to give up. He told all the local businessmen that they had better move in with him on the other side of town. They did, which is what led to the city's blackness in the town square. That led to a drop in bank traffic, and that meant we kept losing money. I fought side by side with my father every day, trying to atone for my mistake that led to all this trouble. I convinced my father to give me access to some of the dwindling funds for stock market trading and arbitrage trades to stop the bleeding. Fortunately, I succeeded in that endeavor, but we continued to suffer losses. My father was the president of the bank, but because of generational changes, he had relatives he reported to, and they started making noises that my father's management was causing them to lose money. Lawsuits started being filed by second and third cousins wanting to gain advantage and take away my father's control of the bank. He kept getting up and fighting every day. I was right by his side. But the stress was too much for my mother. Charles Bachman managed to get us stripped of our country club membership. Mother lost her positions in all the charitable organizations. She was ostracized by the entire town. My mother, who never hurt anyone, was being torn apart by every bitch in this town. Her blood pressure spiked, and the day came when my dad was called to the hospital. Mom had a stroke. After that, he was never the same again. He handed over the day-to-day running of the bank to me, while he took care of Mom himself. I would come home and watch him take care of Mom. When he had free time, then, and only then, would he discuss the bank. She lived for 2 months before she passed away. After that, my father became the personification of the walking dead. 3 weeks after she died, he had a heart attack. In less than a year, I had lost everything I held dear, and now I was given the responsibility of running the bank. I had not been adequately prepared for this responsibility, but now it was thrust upon me. I was looking for every penny I could find. And there were a lot of people who wanted to see me fail, except Charles Bachman, to take the assets of the bank. I was under tremendous pressure. The situation was so desperate that at one point I had to sell my parents' house and my house to support myself in some way. Then I moved into the bank building. All of our tenants moved into the Buckman's building, and I had a vacancy. I converted the space to a kitchen and bathroom, but everything else is just open space. I had to turn off the boiler in the building to save on electricity. That's why I can't take a hot shower. The source of hot water for the whole building is a regular household water heater. Now you know why I live here, in an empty cave with marble tiles and a lack of hot water. As for the day-to-day struggles of the bank, you can imagine what I've been through. From my first days in office, I tried to keep the bank afloat. I had to resort to risky currency speculation and bet on minute-by-minute market fluctuations. At the same time, I knew that if anyone found out about the bank's vulnerable position, they could cut us off at the knees. I had to offer loans to risky businesses that no banking institution would touch. And you know about the ledgers. How I present false figures to show that the bank is safe. But in fact, the real accounts show how much trouble I'm in. If they fall into the hands of the auditors, I'm finished and end up in jail. And that's why the Soren oil venture is so important to me. As you know, I've been working on this deal every day for the last 2 years. If I can pull it off, I'll be solvent again. I'll be able to pay off the bank and my creditors and stop robbing Peter to pay off Paul. I'll be able to keep legitimate books and not worry about my head ending up on the cutting board. Information is knowledge, Janet. That's why I have all those folders in my desk drawers. I have to be upfront so Charles Bachman doesn't try to finish me off. You think I like keeping confidential files on him, Stacy and David? I have to do that to make sure I cover all the bases. Think about it. I have to keep tabs on the woman who broke my heart. I have to keep tabs on my once best friend. And I hate it. I goddamn hate it, but I have to do it. I paused, marveling at myself for finally broaching the subject with someone, and the mental release I felt after the confession. Janet looked at me with gratitude for opening up and confiding in her. But Troy, she said, are you sure you can pull off this deal with Soren Oil? Aren't you afraid of dealing with a Siberian oil field? Janet, as I've explained to you before, my French acquaintances have done everything they can to make this a reality. Once the oil wells penetrate the field, the oil will be processed in a refinery to be built on the coast of the Bering Sea. From there, tankers will take the oil to ports on the west coast of the United States and unload it. The time difference and distance from Middle Eastern supplies will make this project extremely profitable. It will be as close to the truth as it has ever been. The only downside is that a lot of players are getting interested in this. That's inevitable. You can never achieve complete secrecy. Sorrent Oil's share price has been skyrocketing lately, which means someone knows what's on its mind. But I'm close to getting a controlling interest, and when I do, I can dictate terms and success will be assured. I just have to stay in the game no matter how high the stock goes, I explained. Then I can free myself from the Buckmans. I can buy out the rest of my pissed-off relatives, end all the litigation, put the bank on solid ground. And I can finally let David and Stacy go and start living my life again. I'm ready, Janet. I'm ready to commit to someone and live the rest of my days. When I looked directly at her, she realized what I was implying. Her eyes widened and her breath caught. The concept of time was gone. The notion of anxiety was discarded. All that mattered was the primal need to connect with another being. Only for these fleeting moments could I forget everything in the world. So I tried to treasure them. It was already noon when we finally got out of bed, showered and dressed. She told me she had to go to her mom's house for a sleepover. We agreed to meet up Sunday night. I spent some time texting with overseas friends online and then decided to go for an afternoon run. As soon as I stepped outside to do my warm-up and stretching, I saw her leaning against my shabby pickup truck. As much as I wanted to avoid a confrontation, I decided it was best to go and get it over with. As I approached, she got up from my pickup. "Didn't think you'd be out today, Troy," she remarked. "What would you do if I wasn't?" I asked. "I'd come back tomorrow and wait." "What if I don't show up tomorrow?" "Then I'd show up at your office tomorrow and wait all day while you refuse to see me. And the whole town would have another laugh at our expense," she explained. "Well, then it's a good thing I'm here, so you don't embarrass yourself in front of the whole town, isn't it?" I replied venomously. This rant shocked her, but she continued anyway. "Troy, I just want to tell you that I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I hurt you. I never meant to do that." She looked at me with pleading eyes. "For heaven's sake, Troy, you surprised me and I panicked. You have no idea the pressure a proposal puts on a girl. I was put on display, and I had to give you an answer in front of the whole town?" I interrupted. "No, Stacy, you're not getting off that easy. We've already talked about everything. You even showed me what kind of ring you wanted. So don't just stand there and tell me how I surprised and embarrassed you. I wasn't the one who ran out the door. It was David Porter who chased me." I growled back. "Yes, Troy. I ran out, and David ran after me, and we turned out to be cowards and ran off to Europe together. But I was already coming to my senses when I finally realized how screwed up I was. I went to my father and told him I was coming back to you because I love you. He became furious and told me that I had already made him a laughingstock and that I would not be allowed to repeat that mistake by going back to you. He told me that he had publicly ended all personal and business dealings with your family and would not allow me to make him a laughingstock again. The next thing I knew, I was married off to David and banished across the country until my father saw fit for us to return. My marriage was a mistake, Troy. David never loved me. He just liked the idea of being Charles Bachman's son-in-law. He just thought it was some colossal joke to sneak up behind your back and play a prank on me. And after that night, he felt pressured to help me. But he never loved me, Troy. Otherwise, he wouldn't be running after other women night after night. That's if he can get away from my father. David plays a huge psychological role in my father's life because he has a son. And my father absorbs everything, and nothing is too good for his son David," she remarked wryly. Stacy closed her eyes and said, "If I could somehow spare you this pain, I would. My act cost me the best friend I've ever had, and I'll never get him back. It cost me the man I loved more than anything in the world." Though I forced myself to remain cold and detached, inwardly I reacted. I had known this woman for most of my life. Surely she must have known what buttons to push. So to protect myself, I had to respond harshly and push her out of my life. "Yes, Stacy, you can take my pain away. Just tell me, how do I get over losing you? Tell me, how do I survive losing both my parents in the same month? Tell me how I survive day after day despite your father and your husband's attempts to destroy me? Tell me how I survive being an outcast in society, being kicked out of the country club and all social organizations. Tell me how I can sleep properly without waking up from the nightmares you've given me. The furious question threw Stacy back in a fast pace, and I saw tears come to her eyes. I realized I had to run or forever curse my desire to possess her. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go for a run and forget about you again. Barely holding back, she nodded, and I turned away from her and began to prepare for my first step. I almost tripped when she sobbed, "Okay, Troy, I made an effort on myself and now I'm going to live with the consequences. One last thing. I'd like you to reconsider your decision not to go to the reunion tonight. You still have many friends among our classmates who would love to see you. And for those who don't, your presence will prove that you're not a coward." I pretended not to hear her last remark and began my run. The last untainted thing in my life, the zen of running, was now absent, and I had barely gone a mile before I stopped on a bench in a city park and, hidden from view, began to cry. I began to realize that if I lived to be 100 years old, Stacy would still haunt me. I sat there for the rest of the day trying to decide what to do. I looked up at the imposing country club building. Nothing symbolized the exclusivity of the entire town like it did. Only the rich and powerful were allowed in, and the rest of us were forbidden to enter. But on special occasions like reunions, minorities, the downtrodden, the oppressed, the downtrodden who never had their standing were given a brief glimpse into a way of life they would never know. I walked past a few classmates admiring the splendor of the surroundings and nodded to them. Despite being banished from this place 6 years ago, it no longer held my interest. Down a spotless corridor with plush carpeting, decorative vases, landscape paintings, all the trappings of grandeur leading to the banquet room. At the entrance was the obligatory table adorned with the Camden High Tigers logo. Behind it sat my classmate Susan Moy, who I had last seen in my office trying to talk me into working the reunion. Her eyes widened at my approach. "Troy Williams," I announced to her, as if I had to remind her who I was. "I didn't register, so I guess I'll have to pay a late fee, won't I, Susan?" Taking the money from me, she said embarrassedly, "It'll only take a minute, Troy." She started typing rapidly on her laptop. I stood by while Susan worked with the other classmates who had pre-registered. They were given name badges with their graduation picture and their past accomplishments. They were then handed gift bags and allowed to proceed to the banquet hall. Some classmates greeted me, some ignored me, but there was still an uncomfortable atmosphere in the hallway. The laptop printer finally spit out my makeshift badge, and Susan slid it into a flimsy plastic holder which was very different from the pre-made laminated badges waiting on the table to be picked up. I pinned the badge to my shirt, took the gift bag Susan offered me, and lazily peered into it, examining the various cheap trinkets inside. Finding nothing I couldn't live without, I placed the bag on a pile of similar bags discarded by the dumpster and entered the banquet hall. Perhaps it was due to my heightened paranoia, but as I entered the hall, I felt the volume of conversations decrease. Not wanting to confirm my fears, I headed toward the bar. I hastily paid $10 for an overpriced gin and tonic cocktail. After tasting the drink, I was almost tempted to return it because of the cheap gin. Instead, I walked away holding my drink like a shield to not engage in conversation with anyone. This only alienated most of my classmates. A few continued to chat with me, and despite the awkward first comments, I was already starting to enjoy being with a crowd of old friends when David and Stacy entered the room. David was dressed in a business suit to distinguish himself from the others. A casual form of dress had been chosen for this evening. From the beginning, he was eager to show his superiority by looking down on everyone. His aloof demeanor suited Charles Bachman's protege. Stacy, on the other hand, wore a simple black dress and was immediately surrounded by her classmates, insisting that she join them on the dance floor for the electric slide. I watched as David tried to object, but she ignored him to take center stage on the floor. The simple pleasure of doing the dance moves drew a few more classmates to her, who came out onto the floor to join her and enjoy the music. As soon as the song ended, she turned to David and I saw him make a remark that she clearly didn't like. Another song started playing and Stacy tried to pull David onto the dance floor. He resisted until she finally gave up. She stayed by his side just watching the dance until her girlfriends pulled her onto the parquet. The rest of the evening saw a strange dichotomy. a passive Stacy next to David, and a lively, relaxed Stacy dancing on the dance floor. But never with a guy. Whenever anyone approached Stacy, he would ask David for permission to dance with his wife. He always stubbornly objected until the guy left. As the dancing continued, Stacy became increasingly uncomfortable with his behavior. With each refusal, David's arguments became more explicit and more insistent. Luckily for Stacy, her friends kept coming over to give her a chance to relax on the floor. Her dancing on the floor delighted all the men in the room, and I suspect there were quite a few women among them who would have been ready to come out of the closet if only Stacy had beckoned them. Nevertheless, she returned to David after each dance, and her face reflected her growing dissatisfaction. She begged him to dance with her, but apparently the titans of industry are not allowed to have fun. Their irritation was becoming more and more apparent, and there were fewer and fewer people willing to dance with Stacy as they feared an escalating argument. At that moment, Stacy looked down at the floor and caught my gaze. Without asking permission, she left David and walked across the floor to me. All eyes were on us as she held out her hand and said, "Dance with me." David's face could have seriously hurt from his stare. Hell, I had nothing to lose. I crawled after Stacy, who continued to hold my hand, leading me to the floor. "I thought you said you weren't coming to the reunion." I replied, "Not until they told me what a big ass I'd be if I didn't come." Stacy giggled at my reaction as the intro to the slow dance number began. Her eyes widened as she was afraid I would reject the idea of body contact with her. Instead, I shrugged and opened my arms, assuming a pose close to a dance pose. She stepped toward me. I wrapped my arms around her and we began to sway to a slow ballad that had become popular 10 years ago when we were seniors in high school. I felt her hand move up my arm. Then she moved even closer to me, and we continued to twirl slowly among our classmates on the crowded, darkened dance floor. I could smell her shampoo, her soap, and her perfume. It overwhelmed my sense of smell. All those intoxicating, desirable scents were pushing me closer and closer to the point of no return. I closed my eyes and enjoyed the fantasies in my head as we continued our dance. I was lost in my only world that I felt good in. Those few minutes made it bearable, made me believe. Suddenly I realized that the music had stopped. The lights were burning brightly for a quick dance, and I was still doing the dance steps with Stacy, deep in thoughtfulness. In full view of everyone, including David. I was out of place again, in public. Loud laughter erupted from the side. Fred Carter was on one knee pantomiming a proposal, his outstretched hand holding an imaginary ring, and the people around him were laughing. I quickly pulled away from Stacy and rushed over to him. He quickly got up from his defenseless seat and looked at me worriedly as I walked towards him. The laughter subsided as I got closer. The DJ apparently wanted to see what would happen next because, after a slow song, no song came on. Fred Carter, now co-owner of the Ford dealership in town with his father, my classmate, the guy I played on the high school soccer team with, turned pale, anticipating me beating the shit out of him in front of his wife, our friends, and classmates. He even flinched when I stopped next to him. I looked at the chubby, balding man and compared him to how he'd been 10 years ago. The future didn't bode well for Fred Carter. I spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Fred, do you remember the night you, your mother, and your older sister came to my house?" Fred's eyes widened and I realized he wanted to beg me to shut up. "Your mother howled in pain, and so did you and your sister. Do you remember what she told my father, Fred? Do you remember how she told him about your father's drinking? Do you remember how she told my father how he squandered all the money your family had by getting drunk? Remember how she begged my father to help you all? Do you remember what my father did? Do you remember how he came to your house, picked up your drunken father and drove him to a rehab center, 150 miles from home that night? Do you remember how my mother insisted that your family stay with us for that week? Do you remember sobbing yourself to sleep in my room that night, Fred? Do you remember how my father opened a line of credit for your mother so your family could survive while your father balked? Remember when my parents used to come to your house with groceries so you'd have something to eat? And that was after he hooked you back up to the utilities. Remember how my father restructured the loan on your father's business so he wouldn't go into default, and my father wouldn't take away his business? Remember how my father made sure your father attended AA after he was released from the program? Remember when you and your father came back one night and swore you'd do anything for us as a sign of eternal gratitude? Remember the day your heartless father sent you to withdraw money from the Buckman's accounts? Do you remember how ashamed you felt for such treachery? Remember how my father treated you with dignity and respect? Remember that the next time you decide to insult me, you son of a bitch, I said bitterly. I looked around the crowd. I see at least 8 other people here who could tell a similar story. But I'm going to let you all go because, frankly, none of you are worth the trouble. I ventured, looking at them with blazing eyes. No one could catch my gaze. I turned and walked towards the exit. At least no one would ever forget our 10th reunion. Walking quickly across the parking lot, I could hear high heels tapping 3 times behind my every step, trying to catch up with me. I didn't need to explain who was chasing me. I turned in a circle, realizing the futility of trying to escape. I ran my hands through my hair and kept them on my head as she approached. All I could do was watch her approach. I could only stare at her, helpless, pathetic in my pain. "What?" she asked to explain my silence. "I just wanted to see if you had any idea how beautiful you were," I replied sadly. "And I wanted to see how the hell I could get over you." "You don't have to," she replied quietly. "Yes, I do need to," I said. "And it's going to take some time, Stacy, but I'll be fine in the end." "Please don't do this," she begged. "I live that scene every day, Troy. I don't know why I did what I did. I panicked and ran away. For God's sake, Troy, I was only 21 years old and I felt trapped." She grabbed my hands to keep me from leaving. "Saev, when I came to you on our first date, you knew about my history with David," she said. "You knew that, and you pursued me anyway. How are you different from David?" "I never lied to you. I always told you I cared about him. Every damn time, you asked me why I was with him when he treated me like that. Don't you remember, Troy? I told you I was with him because I loved him. I told you that every damn time. But you kept coming back to me. And every time you looked at me, the way your eyes lit up when I was around you, Troy, do you have any idea how I felt? You treated me like a queen, and I realized I had fallen in love with you. I hated the way David treated me, but I was conflicted. You spent every second with me. You would come over and help me do my homework, wash my car, or just walk by my side. You spent time with my dad so you could be at his side. I wish I had $1 for every chess game you lost to him or for listening to him talk about his business. David kept cheating on me, and the next thing I knew, I was cheating on him with you. You kept asking me out, and I started to accept that we were a couple, and David was a thing of the past. But it still pissed me off that he was seeing other girls. One of the reasons David and I were having problems was that he constantly wanted my cherry. When I kept resisting, he would throw me to the girls who were throwing off their panties. I was furious about it. You never gave me ultimatums, and I was able to relax knowing I could move at my own pace, and I fell in love with you. Of course, we didn't have sex, we just kissed a lot. But if you put any pressure on me at all, we would have, and you knew it. But you also knew that I wanted it to mean something when I wore white to my wedding. But always in the back of my mind, I couldn't understand why David let me go. Why didn't he fight for me? How could he let me go to you? Back then, you and I were in college and our lives were scheduled. How we were going to get married and have kids. But while you kept your focus, I was still consumed with my own questions. And unbeknownst to you, David came to me and asked me to take him back. And I found myself sandwiched between the two of you. On the one hand, I had Mr. Serious, hardworking, reliable, and loyal to me. On the other was Mr. Fun, dangerous, carefree, and unreliable. I know it sounds like a cliche, but you two made me feel complete. When we had that night, I panicked, ran away, and hurt you in ways I shouldn't have. I was so ashamed of what I did that I kept running. I ran to Europe, I ran to California after I got married because my father banished me. It didn't change anything, Troy. No matter where I ran, you were still in my thoughts. So I decided to come home and face you. I owe you a debt of gratitude. My life is not turning out the way I wanted it to. I hate my life with David. I hate that he never stopped cheating on me, Troy. But it's not like in high school when he cheated on me like he always did. I had you to comfort me then. And now he's cheating on me. And I'm all alone, Troy. The reality is that I belong to you. I made a bad mistake, and I'm going to take care of it, Troy. Yeah, but there's one big difference between our realities, Stacy. The day after you ruined me, you were still with David. And the next day, and the next. You didn't come back to me. I'm still trapped in a hell I didn't choose. I wake up every day knowing that the woman I love is with another man. Don't you get it, Stacy? You made your choice. And the subsequent circumstances will never allow us to be together, so please let me go. My heartbreaking, pitiful plea brought unshed tears to her eyes. I loosened my embrace. I'm just going to leave, Stacy. Tonight was a mistake, just another big mistake. Where she got the strength from, I have no idea, but she grabbed my wrist and pressed my palm against her tit with force. She looked up at me and said, "Now try to break free." She continued to press my hand against hers and, God help me, I began to squeeze her gently, and then I moved toward her and began to kiss her. She nestled into my arms in agreement. I immediately gazed into her familiar body, but so different after 6 years of change. I tried to trace her new form clad in a dress. She moved her foot toward mine to prolong the contact. I immediately tensed, feeling the discomfort in my pants. "Please, Stacy, stop this right now," I gasped between kisses. She continued to pounce on me and I continued to fight myself. The most telling thing was that I didn't fight her off. I didn't reject her. I was responding to every moment of her passion with my own. She lifted one foot off the ground and rubbed herself against me. In response, she sat on top of me and I put my arms around her. Slowly, she lowered her pelvis to the ground, pressing herself into me. "Stacy, I can't. If I do this, I'll be no better than David. I don't have much left, but my conscience won't let me do it. If your marriage is so terrible, leave him. Divorce him and find someone who will make you happy. There is too much history between us to overcome. Too much animosity and bad blood for us to overcome. Your father will destroy me, or I will destroy him. There is no other way. I'm tired of you hurting me, Stacy. You have to realize that I will always love you. All this time, all this pain, all my pretend hatred for you. It's killing me, Stacy. I'll never forget you, but I need there to be an end between us. I need to be able to consider you my friend, despite what's about to happen. If we continue tonight, I promise you will hate me, or I will hate you for the rest of our lives." My explanation was the catalyst for her tears, and we continued to hug each other, right in front of David Porter. As soon as I moved away from Stacy, he delivered a punch to my jaw. I collapsed onto the seat of my pants, disoriented by the blow. In a daze, I watched Stacy stop David from finishing me off with his legs and sat up, trying to clear my mind. Luckily for me, a few of David's henchmen followed David outside, including Fred Carter, who watched me with a chuckle. The rest of the group joined Stacy to physically restrain him from injuring or killing me. David continued to yell at me, threatening me with death when he was finally dragged away. I continued to sit on the ground as the nausea and dizziness slowly passed. I groaned when I was finally able to stand up. The ridiculous thought popped into my head again. No one would forget this 10th reunion. I limped home, literally and figuratively, all the while fighting to keep the contents of my stomach from rebelling against me. Staggering up the stairs and limping, I walked to the refrigerator. Scooping some ice into a rag, I applied it to the most sore spot. The physical pain was nothing to deal with the heartstrings that had just been torn. Something strange was happening to my body. I was having trouble getting my body to follow the commands my brain was giving me. I felt something wet and damp running down my neck. I finally managed to bring my hand up to it, and with my vision slightly unfocused, I saw blood on my fingers. After what seemed like an eternity, I was able to dial 911 on my phone and, gasping, told them my situation. Fearing that I had a concussion from David's blows, I decided to try to stay awake until the ambulance arrived. When they arrived and took me to the emergency room, I had already passed out. The medical staff fussed around me explaining my symptoms and how I was in this condition. I just told them that someone had gotten into a fight with me and left it at that. Everyone agreed that I had a concussion, aggravated by damage to my inner ear, which should go away without complications. I ended up being kept overnight to monitor my condition if it changed. Early the next morning, several visitors came to see me. The chief of police of Camden, along with the captain of detectives, entered my room. When I saw them, I thought they were going to question me to find out who had beaten me. So I had already mentally prepared myself for that scenario when they started laying out the curves. They weren't interested in who I got into a fight with, but how I could explain my whereabouts after the fight. Specifically, When I called 911 and whether anyone was with me before the ambulance arrived, I advised them to contact the ambulance service and the hospital to satisfy their curiosity about my timeline. If they had any other questions, they could contact my attorney, I informed them. Both men left with frowning faces. In a normal situation, I would have gladly agreed to help the police, but the hostile attitude made my radar wary. An hour later, I found out why. Word had spread through the hospital that Stacy Porter was being nursed back to health in the emergency room and assigned to a bed in the ICU. She had been beaten to a pulp by an unknown assailant and was in a coma from her injuries and the drugs she was being treated with. My attempts to see her were easily thwarted by the medical staff, and I felt frustrated that I could not understand what had happened. Undoubtedly, my attempts to see her would add to the rumor mill. My hospital stay was extended a couple more days because the attending physician wanted to make sure I didn't have any extenuating circumstances related to the concussion. There were only two circumstances that I was aware of. First, I hadn't heard a word from Janet, my bride-to-be, all weekend. I could only assume that she had heard about the spectacle at the country club and was mad at me. Second, I had the misfortune to see David Porter as a visitor. Turning around, I saw him standing in the doorway of my room. A malevolent smirk indicated that he was contemplating my predicament. I continued to stare at him, savoring the results of my sneak attack. Yeah, David, I can understand why you would choose to fight with me, but why would you do that to Stacy? I asked. The smirk got even wider as he replied, "Do what? I have no idea what you're talking about. The only one with a motive to hurt Stacy is you, David. What are you going to do when Charles Bachman decides to interfere?" "Don't worry about that, Troy. He and I have an agreement and the police have already gotten their orders. The perpetrator of the attack on Stacy is some unknown person. When Stacy recovers, she will be sent back to California to live with her sister. Charles Bachman and I will continue to do our usual business of running you out of town like a beaten dog." I shook my head sadly. "Charles Bachman hates me that much? He let you beat up his daughter and blame it on me? He can't stand the way you walk. You humiliate his family all the time. What you and Stacy did at the reunion was just icing on the cake. He fully approved of my measures to punish Stacy. David, I can almost understand why he hates me. But what have I done to you that you hate me to this extent?" My question startled David. For a brief second, the anger in his eyes was replaced by a sense of doubt as he searched for an answer. "Mr. Stacy is better than you. Mr. I think I'm better than everyone else," he replied stiffly. "Did you really think I was going to let you get away with stealing Stacy from me?" "You didn't let anything happen," I quickly interjected. "You left her, and I came up to you and told you I intended to ask her out. You didn't object. And you know what, asshole? I changed my mind and decided I wanted her, and I snuck into her pants every chance I got. And she still wouldn't let me. Said she was saving it for you. Hell, even when we went to Europe after she ran away from you, all she did was mope and cry for you. She still didn't want to sleep with me. I was so angry. Then we flew back to town, and her father read her the will and said she had to marry me because he wouldn't tolerate any more scandals from her. So we played the wedding under the gun, and she cried like a baby when I finally slept with her on our honeymoon. So I go off and have fun, and she sits at home and wishes she'd left her poor Troy. And that's just fine with me. Because when you're finally on the street, she can have you, as far as I'm concerned. I'll be running Bachman's Enterprises, and you'll be throwing garbage in the trash can if I can help it. David, I'll tell you once, you're going to have to go a long way to get rid of me, I replied. And don't think you're going to be able to kick my ass. Even after you hit me and kicked me, you didn't hold me back. I was already getting up to fight back when Stacy stopped the fight. I would have killed you, I said carelessly. The implication that David couldn't hold me back was weighing on him as he walked away. I wanted him to dwell on that fact. Somehow the days at the hospital flew by unnoticed. Janet was still gone. I kept in touch with Tom Jenkins, who was doing business on my behalf. I was thinking of revealing to him aspects of the bank's affairs that he wasn't privy to when I received a message that Stacy wanted to see me. When I entered her room, I shuddered when I saw the extent of her injuries, and my dislike was taken to a new level. How could someone do this to someone they were supposed to love? She invited me to take a seat at her bedside, and I took her frail hand. "I suppose you heard I was banished again," she said weakly. "Heard. I'm sorry, Troy. I didn't want you to get hurt. I guess it's the best thing I can do." She started to cry. Shh, Stacy, it's not your fault. You need to get away. Get away from this because no matter how it ends, you're going to be hurt. Go to California, start over. Find someone you can love and leave me and David and your father in the past. Don't look back, I commanded. I have a loved one here, she insisted, squeezing my hand tightly. I pulled my hand away. Will you love me if I destroy your father, Stacy? Because I intend to do it if I can. Can you bear the thought of being known in this town as the woman who betrayed her own father? I can't let that happen, Stacy. Do you remember the anecdote I told in my office? You mean the one where you implied I was a whore? She asked. You're not the slut, Stacy, I am. You made an offer worth millions of dollars. And I'm so eager to keep up with you that I'm willing to settle for your reputation being worth $5 in the end. I can't hurt you like that. You're too dangerous for me, Stacy. Go away and live in peace. I left, hearing the sobs echoing in the room. On the day of my release, I went to the bank and thanked Tom Jenkins for guiding me in my absence. Janet's desk had been cleaned out and her copy of the secret bank books was gone too. That evening, while in the attic of my apartment, I heard familiar footsteps approaching me. Hi, Janet, I said, not bothering to make sure it was her. I just came by to return your key, she replied. Okay, I replied neutrally. I waited. Mr. Bachman wants to meet you tomorrow night at the country club to discuss business with you, she informed me. Okay, I replied again. She waited for me to ask the questions I should have asked, such as how she knew Charles Bachman and why he had chosen her as his envoy. I was not inclined to oblige her. Finally, she left. I pulled into the parking lot of the country club, turned off the ignition, and just sat in the car. I paid no attention to the few passers-by who approached my car as I entered or exited the building. Gathering all the strength and energy I would need to see the meeting through, I began a series of deep breaths. Finally, I left my old beat-up Chevy amongst the immaculate Cadillacs, Lexuses, and Mercedes and walked up to the entrance. The receptionist occupying the entrance prepared for me to go through the hassle of announcing my name and the purpose of my visit, and then wait for an escort since I wasn't supposed to walk down the hallway alone. I walked past her as if she was invisible and paid no attention to her shocked face and protests as they subsided and I continued down the hallway. Civility was not a priority in my current situation. I would not waste my energy on my subordinates today. As if out of thin air, Thomas Clark, the country club manager, appeared in front of me and kept pace with me. Good evening, Mr. Harrison. How nice to see you here again, he said cordially. I glanced up at him. Thomas Clark was one of the few protesters who had opposed my family's expulsion from the country club. It was his talent for looking after the country club that had kept him from losing his job during the general uproar when Charles Bachman waged war against my family. Good evening, Mr. Clark. It's good to see you too. Despite my intentions, I felt it was my duty to express my appreciation for his efforts. He nodded, and my companion and I continued down the hallway without a word. Nay, Mr. Bachman has reserved an office for your meeting today, he reminded me. We approached the office and he seemed eager to tell me something else. I slowed down to give him that opportunity. With a concerned look on his face, he began, Mr. Harry, Troy, if there's anything I can do for you after tonight. I was touched by his generosity. Thank you, Thomas, it means a lot to me, I assured him, and we entered the office. The atmosphere of the country club office reflected old-school male domination in the best possible way. It wasn't that women were forbidden to be in the room, it was just that due to history and heritage, they were not allowed to occupy it. In the large room, hunting trophies of various wild animals hung on the walls. Pictures of various expeditions hung on the walls. I had a fleeting desire to see if among these photographs were those in which my father had traveled, or whether, in imitation of Stalinist Russia, he had been declared banned and the offending photos removed. The faint aroma of expensive cigars competed with the hickory and oak logs blazing in the huge stone fireplace. Light and shadows danced on the soft leather armchairs and sofas. The gleam of polished mahogany furniture, some topped with Waterford crystal decanters filled with various whiskeys or liqueurs waiting to be consumed. Shelves piled with rare first editions of literary masterpieces, many autographed by the authors. In the corner stood a large globe, a testament to its antiquity, with unexplored parts of the world, names of forgotten countries, and shifting boundaries. And in the very center of the room, confidently dominating his universe, stood my nemesis Charles Bachman. His son-in-law, my former friend David Porter, hovered nearby, acting as a companion. He stared at me, hesitant to attack. He stared at his father-in-law, desperately waiting for the signal to destroy me. I watched the huge figure of Charles Bachman, remembering how he had bullied me years ago when I was courting Stacy. All the little derogatory remarks and jokes I'd tolerated while studying the chessboard during one of the games he'd insisted on playing while I waited for Stacy to get ready for her date. The inevitable gloating when he caught my king and pronounced, "Checkmate," which meant another defeat for me. "Troy Evans Williams," he said, as if giving me a death sentence. "It's been a long time since I've seen you." "Not long enough, Mr. Bachman," I replied. "You wanted to meet me, Mr. Bachman. So tell me why I'm here so I can leave here and go home." "Why don't we have a drink, Troy?" He called the country club manager and asked him to go to the storage room and bring back the decanter of Remy Martin Louis III rare cask that the manager was storing for him. "I'm impressed, Mr. Bachman. How much is a bottle now?" "Last time I bought one of these, Troy, it cost me about $25,000. "If I remember correctly, Mr. Bachman, you only raise a toast when you make a business deal." "That's right, Troy. I've made a very large business deal and I feel like celebrating it." "Do you mind if I ask what you bought?" "Not at all, Troy," he commented, taking the decanter from the manager. Thomas Clark left the room, and Charles Bachman poured healthy portions into 3 decanters of brandy and held one out to me. "I've just bought out the Camden Bank and Trust." He looked at me with his soulless eyes, waiting for my reaction. "Strange. I don't remember agreeing to sell it," I said calmly. David followed me, picked up the 3rd decanter of brandy, and gave me a look of pure schadenfreude. "You're going to have to sell, Troy. The state bank auditor is going to audit your bank on Monday. Copies of the real ledgers you've been hiding from everyone will be submitted for inspection. After they compare them to the fake books you've been scamming everyone with, the investigation will begin. And then all that's left to do is follow the trail, Troy," he explained cheerfully. "How did you find out about the books?" I asked. "Troy, I've always been 2 steps ahead of you," he grinned, shaking the decanter of brandy to warm the drink. "I know about everything you do. I hate to see that you haven't paid attention to any of the business lessons I taught you so long ago. I know about the ridiculous dossiers on me, my daughter Stacy, and my son-in-law David that you keep in your desk drawer. I know about all your business dealings, Troy." He paused to light a smuggled Cuban Cohiba cigar. I continued to wait patiently. "About all your business deals," he emphasized, letting out a ring of smoke, "including the Sorrent oil deal you worked on. And like I said, I have access to copies of your books, Troy. When this story comes out, it's going to make interesting reading across the country." "However, there is an alternative solution," Charles Bachman suggested. "If you turn the bank over to me, the actual books will never be reported. There will be no investigation, and you can walk away rather than spend the rest of your life in state prison on embezzlement charges." "Why would you want to acquire a failed bank, Mr. Bachman?" "You buy it, and you'll have to service the accumulated debts," I asked, perplexed as to the reason. "Just call me sentimental, Troy. I'm thinking back to when you and Stacy were growing up. How you used to come over and play with her. Even when I thought you were going to be my son-in-law instead of David. I'm doing this for old time's sake. You're not tarnishing your mother and father's name. They wouldn't approve of their only child becoming a criminal." "And as far as I'm concerned, you killed my parents, Mr. Bachman," I interjected angrily. "You tried to destroy me and my bank, and after everything you've done to me and my family, you're going to blackmail me into giving you the bank. What's going to happen to my customers when they can't make their car or house payments?" An irritated Charles Bachman replied, "The same thing will happen to my clients as to everyone else. I will foreclose on them. I'm in the business of making money, boy. If I told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. In nature, the big ones eat the little ones. That's a lesson neither you nor your father ever realized." "I can manage without you, Mr. Buckman. I have a deal ready to go involving Sorrenth's oil reserves. Once the deal is signed, all my financial worries will be over. The money goes back to the bank and no one will ever know about it. Even if you denounce me, you'll have no way to prove it." Charles Bachman and David Porter laughed in my face. "You can't count on Sorrent's oil stocks, Troy. Unbeknownst to you, I was buying up every stock that came on the open market. I now own 63% of the stock, and that number keeps going up. I'll be richer than Bill Gates and Warren Buffett combined before this is over, and you'll be left in the dust, Troy. Checkmate, Troy. I remained silent while he and David enjoyed my obvious torment. He studied my discomfort as I began searching the room for an exit. Any way out? I glanced at the table where an ornate chess set stood ready for play. I was reminded of all the games I had played with Charles Bachman and lost. I continued to stare intently at the chessboard. Stanton's ebony pieces and their counterparts carved from ivory by a master craftsman many years ago. Now they waited silently for the game. Charles Bachman followed my gaze, and a smile flashed across his face. You know, Troy, it's been a while since we played chess. Why don't we make a little bet? If I win, David becomes president of Camden Bank and Trust, and you go to jail. And if I win? I suggested, taking a sip of very expensive brandy. The very idea seemed like a slap in the face to Charles Bachman. I could see him blushing and trying to contain himself over this ridiculous idea. He narrowed his eyes and said, "If you win, you'll remain president of Camden Bank and Trust and work for me for the rest of your life and stay out of jail." Sir, if it weren't for the fact that you've never beaten me at chess, I might have lost on purpose to keep you in check. But I think it would be best if you left this town with your tail between your legs. He hissed angrily at me. He turned away and grabbed a couple chess pieces, shielding himself from my gaze. He turned to me again and extended both fists at arm's length. There were pawns hidden in his hands. All I had to do was guess correctly, and I would start with white and gain first move advantage. He kept waiting for me to decide which hand to open. I waited half a minute before I put the palm of my right hand under Charles Bachman's left fist. A knowingly victorious glint appeared in his eyes as he moved the pawn into my hand. I clenched my hand into a fist, and the pawn remained undisclosed to everyone. Since I know I have a black pawn in my hand, I chose your remaining hand. I'll start with the white one. I opened my hand to reveal the black pawn in my hand. A look of anger and disappointment appeared on Bachman's face as he had not calculated my trickery. Since I had first played with him, I had been given the opportunity to choose pawns. Contrary to the law of averages, I always lost. It was only after my hands were down that I dared to ask him how he had achieved such success. With a deft hand, he always chose two black pawns. Even in such a small thing as a game of chess, he strove to gain an advantage. We took our seats at the table. Only culture and civilization separated gladiators from bloodshed. David moved over and stood next to his father-in-law, as befitted a loyal vassal. I made an initial pawn move. He immediately responded with a knight move. This convinced me that his tendency to rely on knights in openings was still there, even though I had not played with him for 6 years. I made a bishop move on the queen's side. He brought out a second knight. This confirmed that he intended to outplay his knights. 3 moves later, my knight hit the queenside bishop pawn. "Understood," I announced quietly. He looked puzzled by his predicament. My knight was ready to take the king or the queenside rook next move. Usually, the queen's countermove is to take the threatening knight. In this game, it would not have helped him. My bishop was ready to take the queen in response to the attack. Another common counterplay was to move the king and sacrifice the queenside rook. That couldn't happen here. Bachman played his usual difficult game, protecting the king and depriving him of the opportunity to maneuver. He was forced to accept the sacrifice of my knight. And yet he was looking for a way out. His eyes roamed over every piece on the board. I leaned back in my chair to savor another taste of brandy. "You'll have to accept my knight, Charles. This is your only game." Again, he looked at me. Not only for having the audacity to capture his queen, but also for having the audacity to address him as an equal and not my superior. I continued to wait for the inevitable. Finally, he moved his queen in disgust and took my knight. Without hesitation, I moved my bishop and captured his queen. I held the queen in front of him. I just stared at the piece rubbing against the princess's ebony. "Funny, in the other game we're playing, you had another queen, but it didn't help you," I commented. "What are you talking about, Troy?" "About your queen spy you launched into my office, Janet Temple. Your secret agent I had to deal with." I watched him belatedly trying to set his royal bishop in motion. I began to lay out the following sequence of events. "It took me a while to realize who your queen was," I continued. "But once I did, she was easy to neutralize. All I had to do was feed her false information, and I knew she would return to you. I brought out my queen to start fighting as we continue to play. You see, Chuck, there are two sets of books, but the fake books show that the bank is in trouble. The public books are real and show that the bank is thriving. I made you think my bank was in trouble because I knew what your natural reaction would be. The big one always eats the little one. Isn't that what you've always said, Chuck? He had a stunned look on his face at the fact that I had used a patronizing nickname and moved my queen diagonally across the board to capture his queen rook. Once again, I was able to calmly say, "Got it." I've known for almost 2 years that Janet was passing information to you, Chuck. I knew that you forced her into an intimate relationship with me so that I would lower my defenses. I set up several situations where I fed you information through Janet. After you managed to thwart my attempts with her information, you trusted her 100%. Then every once in a while I would supply her with a legitimate nugget for you to save her. It kept you on the hook. Bachman moved his king from a dangerous position to the next row. I then moved my queen horizontally across the board, and now his queenside rook was also a victim of the game since I had removed it. The queen and both crows are gone. You're not playing too well, Chuck, I remarked. But back to Janet. You relied entirely on her reports, and she relied entirely on the information I gave her. You see, I was constantly updating the false forged books to show the gradual decline in the bank's assets. Janet would check the information on her computer, double-check it on mine, and then pass it on to you. Janet was never in a position to do a legitimate audit, so I kept passing you false information. This allowed me some respite to repair the initial damage you caused. The scary steps I had to take over and over again to build up the necessary margin of safety. I shelled out every dollar to slip half a point on a stock and then take money out of the market and lock in a profit. Janet always got the information a little later than she needed to in time to contact you, and you had time to squash me like a bedbug. It must have been frustrating for you to see me slip through your fingers day after day. Of course, for every one of my winnings, you mistakenly said that I was losing 4 or 5 other trades a day. You may have checked and verified the daily trading of the stock in question, and the trading activity report seems to confirm Janet's information. He woodenly took my bishop on the queen side, and I responded by taking one of his knights. He made a move with his remaining knight, trying to put pressure on my king. I began destroying his pawns with my queen. As you can see, Chuck, it won't do any good when the state auditor comes on Monday. The real books will be presented, your information will be noted, and an investigation will begin. The only evidence you have is a computer printout from Janet, your and David's secondhand accounts of this information, and Janet herself. There will be no corroborating evidence. The computer from Janet's office and my personal computer are already gone and have been replaced with new ones with only the correct numbers on them. You will never find the hard drives with the erroneous information you relied on. The check will take about a week, and the final report will vindicate me and my bank. Now my rooks were free, the end of the game was approaching. I took his bishop king. As you can see, Chuck, your plan is going almost as well as your chess game. You underestimated me, and now you're paying the price. His remaining knight fell, and Bachman's last major piece besides his king was the bishop on the queen side. I had moved my king to the dark square. Now his queenside bishop would be powerless against my king. With the help of the queen and rook, I began to force his king to retreat. One agonizing move after another, and Bachman wouldn't give up. But I didn't want him to. I wanted his king to fall into the trap like a rat, and finally I succeeded. My next move would checkmate him, and he knew it. His face was burning with anger at the humiliating defeats I had inflicted on him this evening. But there was more to come. So, Chuck, it looks like I beat you at chess for the first time. The moral of the story is this. Never underestimate the lengths your daughter's horny boyfriend will go to in order to score points with her father, including losing a chess game. I guess I can count myself lucky I didn't go with you and your drunken friends on a hunting safari in Alaska. The thought of having to hang around you and suck up to you for a week still makes me want to puke. Thank God David had no problem kissing your ass every day. David automatically lunged toward me, wanting to get into a physical confrontation until he saw the anticipation in my eyes. I think he realized that if he and I got into a fight, I wouldn't stop until one of us was seriously injured or dead. He wasn't ready for that level of action. I stared at him for a while, Then, insultingly brushed off the credible threat and continued my dissertation. I know pinning Janet on me was your idea, Chuck, but which one of you got the idea to put her in my bed, you or David? Neither of them admitted it. I guess I'll never know how it happened. Maybe one of you was at fault. Maybe you both, independently of each other, hinted to Janet to try to spark a friendship. Or maybe Janet did it on her own initiative. What I do know is that I am torn apart again by the reminder of the betrayal of a girl I cared for. What a brilliant idea to throw me off balance while you plot to steal my bank from me. Not only would I have to relive the agony, but I would have to experience the humiliation anew every day. And that pisses you off, Chuck? The fact that I live to fight another day? The fact that my very existence reminds you of the sins you committed against my father? Normally, if I pissed you off, that would be cause for concern, because even if I foiled your plan and saved my bank, I could expect you to regroup and launch another attack, but that's where the genius of a queen like Janet comes in, I continued to lecture Bachman, as if he couldn't stop listening to the wreck I had in store for him. I know she also told you about the oil reserves in Sorrento, that my bank was so counting on to bring it back to the black. Imagine, an oil field estimated at several million barrels that is yet to be developed. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it, Chuck? And it's too good to be true, Chuck. Once again, I fed you false information through Janet. I created Sorrento's oil reserves out of thin air, Chuck. You so willingly believed everything Janet told you that you didn't do your due diligence. Why would I? I certainly wasn't cunning enough to outsmart you. I've never been cunning. And you knew I couldn't decide to make a false move. So everything I invested in had to be in good faith. Thanks to me, you saw a vision of the mythical El Dorado. The fact that you would destroy me was just the cherry on top. So you flipped through all the test reports and engineering reports that promised unquestionable success. All those reports from my desk that Janet stole for your benefit. All those reports from the straw figures I created. They existed only in my imagination and from my hands. But after creating enough papers, I pushed you closer and closer to the edge until you jumped off the cliff voluntarily. In the course of all the international business deals I've had to make, I've had ample opportunity to discover enough unethical businessmen who would help me pull a scam on you for a percentage. With their help, I set up several shell corporations on shore. Every time you bought stock in Sorrento, your money came back to me. I created a false bidding war so that the stock would rise and you would lose your money much faster. All the debt you took on caused Buckman Incorporated's stock prices to fall, so I bought them cheap with your own money. Through a syndicate of holding companies and mutual funds, I now own the majority of your company's stock, Chuck. Charles Bachman's complexion underwent a startling change. Instead of a face flushed with anger, there was a shocked expression on his face as I continued to pound on it with the gavel. Within a month, a new board of directors for Bachman Inc. will be formed. All of them will be chosen by me. My first order of business will be to remove you, Chuck, on a vote of no confidence. The second would be to elect me chairman of the board. The third would be to rename the company Harrison Williams Incorporated in honor of my father. I realize you'll still be rich because of your stock holdings, Chuck, but your legacy is gone, and that's what's important to you. The days of you being the benevolent despot of this community are gone. Your lavish estate, the Rolls Royces you and your wife drive, the condos you own, the private jet, all of this, titled in the company's name for tax purposes, will belong to me. However, I will allow you to keep your mistress. Charles visibly flinched at my revelation that I knew about his secret life. David watched stunned as his inflexible father-in-law's feet of clay appeared. You'll spend the rest of your life complaining about me to the FBI, the SEC, and every other law enforcement agency you can think of, and it won't pay you back. I've covered myself with countless layers of protection, and I keep adding them. You will grow old and bitterly regret your powerlessness to unravel my cases. The political influence you once enjoyed will fade, and you will be left all alone, screaming in an empty room for revenge. I finished the last drops of brandy. I leaned forward toward Charles Bachman, who was now gulping air like a fish out of water. I moved my queen to the last row. You see, Chuck, you've been wrong all along in your analogy of business and nature. It's not the big one that eats the little one. It's the fast one eats the slow one. I reached up with one finger and slowly tilted it toward the king. Shamat. I whispered the etymological Persian term that had morphed over the centuries into checkmate. The king was taken prisoner. I left the room without bothering to look at its occupants. The events that followed were dramatic and stirred the city with gossip for several more months. I ousted Charles Bachman and David Porter. Finding themselves out of their comfort zone, they turned on each other, blaming each other for their downfall. Mrs. Bachman divorced her husband after publicly exposing his next mistress and proceeded to beat millions out of him during the divorce proceedings. As I suspected, Charles tried to get the authorities to investigate my case, but to no avail. As he lost his wealth, he also lost his political power, as no one admired him unless he had money behind him. His mistress left him in search of a better deal, and he himself entered into a series of relationships that continued to lead him on a downward financial spiral. It was pathetic to watch him continue to portray himself as a VIP, while he was the laughingstock of the entire town. The town was shocked when he woke up one morning and found out that he had committed suicide by shooting himself. Only family members were invited to the funeral. Stacy and her sister flew to the funeral and flew back immediately after it was over. She made no attempt to contact me. I knew she blamed me for my father's death. However, David Porter tried to disrupt the funeral to convince Stacy to stop the divorce proceedings she had started while in California. After this fiasco, he spoke publicly about his relationship with Janet Temple. Yes, my Janet Temple. They went to an undisclosed location. Power is an aphrodisiac, Henry Kissinger once said. I tend to agree with him. 23 months after my successful campaign against Charles Bachman, I was still the lucky recipient of the attention of many fine ladies. I was under no false illusions that I had somehow become more handsome, more masculine, or that my personality had undergone a much-needed makeover. No, all I represented was a potential source of endless money, security, and prestige. Was I upset about this? Not at all. I knew what the game was, and so did the ladies. We were satisfying desires for physical connections, and I was damn sure there wouldn't be an emotional connection with any of them. I made sure that any financial obligations imposed on me by my lovely ladies were minimal and transient. In my shallow world, it was enough to make ends meet. Still, sometimes deep into the night, I would leave my slumbering partner for the night and spend my time just watching the quiet city courtyard from my third-floor window. I was still looking for someone to believe in, standing like a sentry over the moonlit city that was undergoing a renaissance. Taking over Harrison Williams Enterprises, I approached several manufacturing companies about moving to Camden to end the history of the city known as a one-company town. By offering commercial loans at a very low rate and convincing state officials to provide various tax incentives, a large number of companies decided to take advantage of these offers. As a result, the city of Camden experienced a boom. Initially, I assumed that Buckman's Financial Plaza would soon look like what downtown once looked like, an abandoned concrete ghost town synonymous with Charles Buckman's failure. But I commissioned a study and concluded that it was prudent to let Buckman Financial Plaza continue to do business and thrive. People psychologically wanted and needed options. People like Fred Carter, a classmate of mine who ran a Ford dealership. Fred would have resented having to dutifully submit to me to run his banking business at Camden Bank and Trust. But if he had been offered to run the business at Buckman's Savings and Loans, he would have gladly accepted. I didn't care which organization got the money, as long as it came back to me. Oh, I was indulging my ego. The Camden Country Club did the unprecedented thing of rescinding my expulsion from the club and granting me membership. I guess after word got out that Harrison Williams Enterprises was thinking of putting a landfill next to the golf course, I figured my opinion might sway the Harrison Williams board of directors. It seemed to me that every time I visited, I was looked at with hostility and irritation. And I returned to the country club, but as long as they left me alone, I left them alone. For extra importance, however, I tried to encourage minority membership and converted the office into a daycare center as soon as it was remodeled. In addition, I had dinner at the club every night to demonstrate my power. Taking advantage of the situation, I got Thomas Clark, the country club manager, to have full autonomy in running the club. He heeded my suggestion to convert the restaurant into a 5-star establishment. I now had a place where I could bring my business lunch partners for a nice meal or a round of golf, or even both. One of my fondest memories is playing golf with a woman, the COO of a corporation I wanted to do business with. She hit her second shot on the 13th hole on the fifth dogleg. Somehow we ended up together in the thicket of the woods and found a new source of entertainment on the golf course. At least I finally got to enjoy playing golf. I was finally able to grasp the zen of golf, albeit in a different form than expected. Hey, you enjoy your view of the hole and I'll enjoy mine. In fact, the same executive returned for another visit and, oh miracle, hit his shot right into the same thicket, causing us to have to disappear into the woods again. We were having a leisurely dinner at the clubhouse, enjoying the risky ambiguities involved in playing golf, when Stacy showed up. To say I was confused is an understatement. I realized that a piece of food strung on my fork had fallen off as I held the appliance in the air. My companion frowned, interrupting the conversation, and turned to look at the charming woman approaching our table as I put my fork down. She wasn't the only one. The entire dining room fell into silence as all eyes focused on Stacy. God, I hadn't seen or heard from her since she'd left 2 years ago. And now the weight of the aftermath of what had happened to her father and David was upon me. I mentally prepared myself for a confrontation. I would try to handle it as best I could. At least I had an obligation to do so. As she walked towards me, her attention was directed solely at me. I don't know if she was intentionally or not ignoring my dinner companion, but Stacy didn't seem interested in the fact that I wasn't alone and that we were in a crowded country club dining room. She was now standing beside my chair, towering over me as I prepared myself for my impending humiliation. Then she knelt down beside my chair and said, "Many years ago I made a terrible mistake. I'm here to correct it, if you'll allow me. Troy Williams, will you marry me?" One could not help but notice the sincerity in her voice or on her face. Somehow she was willing to forget about how I had destroyed her father, her family's fortune, her husband. All she cared about was that she loved me and was willing to put everything on the line for me. For a moment I wondered if I could I be that forgiving? Would I be able to let go of the pain and be with the woman I so desperately wanted? Would my ego allow me to counter the betrayal of my revenge with her public subterfuge? Were the ghosts of my parents peering over my shoulder, begging me to let go of my past and connect with the only woman I could truly love? I was well aware of what awaited the unwitting onlookers. Sitting across from me, my dinner companion had a range of expressions on her face. There was the shocked, stunned look with which she reacted to Stacy's suggestion. There was an expression of jealous hostility at this breach of etiquette that could only occur between two beautiful women in direct competition, and something latent in the clinical detachment with which she watched the events unfold. Now it was me at the table. Now I was feeling the pressure that every woman feels when proposing. This is exactly how Stacy must have felt when I had stumped her years ago. How could I feel like my brain was overflowing with all the reasons to say yes and no at the same time? I so desperately wanted my heart to say yes, and my fears wanted me to say no. And I was pressured to answer publicly, just like Stacy had been pressured to do on that fateful night so long ago. No. I wasn't sure I'd really said it until I saw Stacy's calm expression crumble and tears come to my eyes as she staggered up and, retaining the last vestiges of dignity, walked out of the dining room with her head held proudly high, ignoring all the gawkers. I don't think I've ever hated myself as much as I did at that moment. An excited murmur ran through the room as I quietly beckoned Manager Thomas Clark over to my table. "Yes, Mr. Williams," he inquired. "Thomas, I know how impossible it is to keep things private in this age of social media. So I need you to let everyone know how displeased I will be if I hear a word about this on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or any other site that embarrasses Miss Bachman," I instructed him quietly. "I understand, Mr. Williams, and I'll take care of it." He stepped out from behind his desk and headed straight for Fred Carter's desk. Less than a minute into the conversation, I saw Fred blush and begin furiously deleting something from his smartphone. When he finished, Fred looked at me with a concerned expression on his face. Thomas Clark had already retreated to a neighboring table. A few minutes later, Thomas Clark informed me that if anyone was foolish enough to discuss this event publicly, they risked incurring my wrath. After what I had done to Charles Bachman and David Porter, no one wanted to test my mettle. I turned my attention back to my dinner companion. A strange look of bewilderment appeared on her face. "Well, I've never had a date like this before." She looked me straight in the eye. Really? I finished my wine. It happens to me all the time, I explained sharply, hoping the joking answer would hide the emotional cauldron raging inside me as I looked at her again. She pounced on me before we even got to the car. When we got to my bed, we had the best night of our lives. When dawn broke, we were sitting at the kitchen table, not batting an eye and tiredly sharing cups of coffee. I think I'll call a cab to take me to the airport so I can leave early for the office. What's your hurry? I asked. No, babe. I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere. I just know when it's time to leave. Last night I was mad at that woman for disrespecting me and proposing to you in front of me. So I drove you home and shook the shit out of you. But three things make me realize that we can't have a future like that. One, this woman really loves you enough to go to such a public act. Two, I could never do that for any man. So whatever we are, this isn't a case where I'm willing to go that far for you. I only had to nod in response to her words as I was in agreement with her. She was fun to be with, but we both knew we weren't right for each other forever. You mentioned three things. What's the third one? I asked. Last night, everyone in this room could look at her and tell she was in love with you. I kept looking at you and could tell you were in love with her. In love or in business, don't take on something you can't excel at. I've already lost that battle. Weighing her words and pondering my next steps, I watched the cab drive away, taking her to the airport. The wait was less than 24 hours. Stacy reappeared at the country club as I dined alone, got down on one knee again, and again publicly proposed to me. Once again, I was going through a storm of conflicting emotions as I was once again put in front of a choice. Somehow, I managed to say no again. And again, my negative answer caused Stacy the pain of rejection, and she slowly walked away trying to keep her composure, tears streaming down her face. The room buzzed with excitement again, and I called Thomas Clark over and asked him to repeat my favor from the night before. I knew it was impossible to keep people from whispering about the event, but I could still try to limit the damage to local gossip only. On the third evening, the dining room was packed with people waiting for Stacy to arrive. They were not disappointed when she showed up and proposed to me again. Unlike the onlookers, Stacy was disappointed that I again refused to accept her proposal. This time, Thomas Clark didn't have to talk people out of airing what they had witnessed. He automatically went into damage control mode. Stacy showed up the next night and left disappointed. And the next night again. And the next. And the next. It went on like this every night. A week went by, then a month. And Stacy kept coming over every night to propose to me. I couldn't understand how she could take so much pain and rejection. But every night she came, hoping I would say yes, and every night she left with her heart torn apart by my rejection. Her friends begged her to stop, to save what little she had left and start over away from our hometown. She continued to ignore them. Then a few brave men approached me and suggested that I stop eating lunch at the country club to put an end to this farce. I ignored them. Night after night it went on. One change was that I never invited him to lunch at the club again. At least I was able to contain the conflict between just the two of us and not subject anyone else to the spectacle. It was Friday night, and I waited. By this time, the initial excitement of Stacy and I's little dramatic performance had been replaced by a lukewarm agreement with the crowd. Many were no longer paying attention to Stacy's encouraging arrivals and sad departures. She showed up right on time, remembering to dress for the occasion and never giving up hope of convincing me to change my mind. She walked over and started to kneel when I raised my hand to stop her. Stacy, today marks 1 year since you came back and asked me to marry you. Every night I say no, but you keep coming back. How long are you going to keep this up? It was noticeable that she was agitated by the change of ritual, but pulling herself together, she said, Troy, I'm going to keep coming here every night and proposing to you in hopes that you'll finally agree that we belong together. And it doesn't matter if it happens tonight or tomorrow or years from now. I will do everything in my power to right the wrong of not accepting your proposal. This earnest reply struck her with its sincerity. You know your GPA is pretty bad in this case. She ignored my futile attempt to smooth things over. All I have to do is be right once, and then you and I can bat a 1,000 for the rest of our lives. Look, Stacy, I don't have as much practice at this as you do, but I can probably do it better. Before she realized it, I had already slid off the chair and was kneeling in front of her. My hand reached into my pocket and snatched the object. Now that it was clear, Stacy screamed, oh my God, 3! Tears of joy rushed from her eyes and her hands reached for my mouth in bewilderment as I opened the box and handed her the ring. Stacy Ellen Bachman. Yes, she shouted. You? Yes. You're getting married. Yes. 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 Me? Yes, 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 yes. Oh God, yes. I'm going to marry you. In a rush of adrenaline, she lifted me to my feet, pulled me to her, and began kissing me, and the hall erupted in wild applause. She sobbed in my ear. Thank you, Troy. Thank you for making me so happy. Somehow, despite her holding on to me tightly, I managed to slip the ring onto her finger, which entailed another round of fervent kissing. I didn't think I could get her to unhook herself from me, but eventually her girlfriends, who were present, pulled her off me while they oohed and awed over the ring. And of course, they began promptly planning the wedding. I took Thomas Clark aside and told him to transfer all the bills to my account. Yeah, even that bastard Fred Carter. I also told him to get that rare bottle of cognac I'd inherited when I took possession of all of Charles Bachman's assets. It was time to finish the bottle with the toast I shared with my bride-to-be. It was time to let go of the past. I watched her as she took aim at me like an out-of-control kamikaze. She was holding a large yellow-reddish object in her hands. I tried to prepare myself that if she decided to throw it at me at close range, I would try to anticipate the trajectory it would take to hit my body. Instead, she held out her hand for me to take the object from her. Peace, she announced proudly. Peach, I corrected her. I emphasized the chi to explain to her how the fruit was pronounced. She nodded with the confidence of a 3-year-old and repeated, Peace. Finished with that task, she turned and waddled back to the waiting baskets full of ripe, juicy fruit. If history repeats itself, in a few moments I will be the owner of another peach. I gently squeezed the peach in my hand and sniffed it. It was ripe, ready to eat. I dipped the fluffy fruit into a bucket of watery ice that held several bottles of beer, which I rewarded myself with for finishing the harvest. Then with a penknife, I cut the fruit in half, then into quarters, and removed the peach pit. I then cut it into smaller pieces so Karen, my child, could enjoy a tasty treat. Karen returned with another peach and held it out to me. Peace, Daddy, she demanded. Next to me, the love of my life started laughing at us. I looked at Stacy and smiled at her, then returned my attention to Karen. Peach, I repeated, holding out a small piece of fruit to her. Her eyes sparkled as she tasted the fruit, and the pulp and juice lined her face. Somehow she always managed to leave an uneaten peel that got on my shirt. Don't feed her too much. It's too close to dinner time, Stacy reminded me. I won't, honey, I said, taking the opportunity to take another sip of nectar of the gods, and the cold, amber liquid slid down my throat. And no more beer, or you'll be completely useless while I'm RAVEing you tonight. Honey, she's 3 years old. She has no idea what the word means, Stacy reminded her. It's never too early to instill that habit. I don't want her babbling. She shouldn't be repeating words in public. Okay, I understand what you're saying. But while I'm eating your peach, you can eat mine too. I held out a slice of peach to her and a mischievous grin appeared on her face. I intend to let you eat my peach all night long, she smiled teasingly. Just remember, I have to unload those baskets at the farmer's market early in the morning. Troy, that means we need to start early tonight so you'll be ready to go in the morning. I realized from the lecherous look on her face that she had plans for me in the morning as well. But to help you out, take one of those kids you hired as an assistant and have him do all the work for you tomorrow. I think something will come up that will need our undivided attention. I smiled back and then looked back at the lot where our residence was located. When we got married, I had agreed to stay in the bank building, but Stacy was adamant and stated that she was not going to raise a family in the bank building. I called my old family friend, Mrs. Fuller. She was past the age where it was difficult for her to take care of her farm. Added to that was the fact that her daughter insisted on moving west to live with her. I ended up buying the Fuller farm and a few other parcels of land that would allow me to be a full-time gentleman farmer, but not overworked. All of my business ventures had good managers who kept an eye on my assets, and I continued to make sure the engine was running efficiently. Now, it didn't take up every waking second. I soon learned about crop rotation, irrigation, and pest control. Stacy was hard at work renovating our new homestead, and soon she informed me that one of the rooms needed to be converted into a nursery. Karen came into our lives, and any doubts either of us had about our marriage were instantly dispelled. Strangely enough, our happiness annoyed the locals who watched our trials and tribulations up close. They couldn't understand why I was willing to marry a girl who had rejected me, and they couldn't understand why Stacy would marry me after I rejected her. I could write an entire encyclopedia trying to convey our reasoning and feelings, or I could just say that I love her and she loves me, and we finally caught ourselves at the right time. I sleep well. I'm not haunted by the ghosts of my parents. Why should they be haunted by me? They only wanted the best for me, and it finally happened. I'm not haunted by the ghost of Charles Bachman. He can't hurt me or Stacy anymore, so it doesn't matter. It's the same with David Porter and Janet. The only person who can hurt me is Stacy, and deep down, I know that won't happen again. The lessons we learned were painful, given to us at a terrible cost, dearly bought and dearly cherished. The sudden epiphany I had as I watched Karen bring me another peach was striking in its simplicity. Karen climbed into my lap and with all the God-given innocence in her eyes, looked into mine, holding out the fruit to me. "Peace, Daddy." I kissed her. "Peace?" I said yes. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.